Hello and welcome to Definitions of Poverty for the Work, Poverty and Welfare A-Level Sociology. So today we are looking at the definitions of poverty. There are many definitions of poverty. Firstly, we're going to look at absolute poverty. This is the lack of the minimum requirements needed for survival. So an individual is classed as being in absolute poverty if they can't afford the basic necessities, for example, food, shelter and warmth. Rowntree set up the first major study of poverty in the UK in 1899. He made a list of what was essentials needed for life and then recorded how many families could afford them. Those whose income was too low were classed as in poverty, and people were shocked to find that a large proportion of York in the UK was in poverty. However, there are some criticisms of Rowntree's study. His definition of poverty didn't allow for any wasted food, and it assumed that the cheapest options were always available. The lists were compiled by experts and didn't match the lifestyle of the people that he surveyed. He did listen to his critics, however, and for two further studies that he published in 1941 and 1951, he added more items to the lists that he thought was essential. By this time, more people could afford the basics on the list as the economy grows. His conclusion was that poverty was disappearing fast in the 20th century of the UK. Another study of poverty, looking at absolute poverty, was done by Drevnowski and Scott in 1966. They found a level of living index which worked out the income needed for basic needs. These also included the cultural needs, which Rowntree didn't include. But on the other hand, it's debatable whether cultural needs, such as TV, should be included in a study of absolute poverty. Bradshaw in 1990, however, devised the budget standard measure of poverty. This was similar to Rowntree's idea of absolute poverty. He studied the spending patterns of the poorer people and used those patterns to calculate an adequate budget. Anyone who earned less than the adequate budget was classified as poor. The main difference between the approaches was that Bradshaw studied how many people actually spend their money, whereas Rowntree assumed people weren't poor if they earned more than the usual total cost of essential items. And because Bradshaw's test isn't relative, it gives clear and unambiguous statistics that are easy to compare between different studies. However, some critics have argued that Bradshaw set a very low adequate budget, so his conclusions are not a true reflection of deprivation in society. Relative poverty is a comparison with the average standard of living. So many sociologists favour the relative definition of poverty. So it's not looking at whether people have the basics like food, shelter, warmth. The problem with relative poverty is that some people will always appear to be poor, which is true because everybody who's not the richest person in the world is going to feel poor in comparison. Also, if the rich get richer more quickly than the poor get richer, then relative poverty will increase, even though the lives of the poor improve. So it's not looking at how the lives of the poor improve. Townsend in 1979 looked at relative deprivation. So he came up with a deprivation index, which was a list of 60 things that many people in the UK have. The list included social activities such as inviting people over for meals, possessions such as owning a refrigerator, a TV, those sort of things. From his list of 60 things, however, he selected 12 that he thought were equally essential to the whole population. He then gave each household a deprivation score based on whether or not they had the items on his shortlist of 12 items. Looking at statistics, he found the deprivation score went up rapidly after wealth dropped below a certain threshold. The threshold was about 150% of the 1979 basic supplementary benefit levels, now called income support. So he said that all households earning below this level were suffering from poverty. He calculated that 22.9% of the population were suffering from relative poverty. To make an AO3 point of this, P. Shord, 1987, argued that Townsend Deprivation Index is too subjective and culturally biased, putting shortlist items such as having cooked breakfasts and Sunday dinner. Sunday dinner is more of a Christian, British sort of idea, rather than other religions and other countries, therefore being culturally biased. Another AO3 point is Wedderburn, who criticised Townsend's method for creating the deprivation index. She argued that he should have carried out research into the behaviour of people in society. It seemed to her as though he had just picked items based on his own cultural opinions, rather than researching what the country was like and what they did. So, Mack and Lansley were the people who measured poverty. So, they measured poverty in 1985 in a similar way to Townsend, but acted on some of the criticisms that were made. They defined poverty to be an enforced lack of socially perceived necessities. They used a survey to determine which items to include on the list of perceived necessities. They asked people what they considered to be the necessities. Any items that were classified as essential by over 50% of the people asked were added to the list. They therefore ended up with a list of 22 items. They surveyed households to find out what they lacked. Households could answer if they had the item, or didn't want the item, or wanted it but couldn't afford it. Only those who said that they wanted it but couldn't afford it were considered deprived. Mack and Lansley therefore argued that their figures would only reflect involuntary deprivation. If a household involuntarily lacked 3 or more items from the list, they were then classified as poor. Mack and Lansley reported that 14% of the British population were living in poverty in 1983. When they repeated the study in 1990, they found that this figure had actually risen to 21%. In 2012, a Poverty and Social Exclusion report, PSE, found that 33% of the population were living in poverty according to this method. Therefore, poverty has increased again. The list of necessities changes over time. For example, a telephone was considered a necessity in the 1990 study, whereas it hadn't been in the 1983 study. Critics have argued that because the surveys didn't produce the same list of necessities, the results are not directly comparable. Another type of poverty is subjective poverty, whether people think they're in poverty. So subjective poverty is based on how people feel. It's their own evaluation of how much money they need to live a decent life. It all depends on their expectations. So subjective poverty studies asks questions such as, what income do you think is necessary to not be in poverty? The Poverty and Social Exclusion Survey in 2000 found that the proportion of people who considered themselves to be in poverty was similar to the scientific consensual poverty figure. This means subjective poverty is a good way of assessing how widespread poverty is, although the same people aren't necessarily in poverty according to both measures. Social exclusion is defined as when people can't participate in society. So this is a much wider range of deprivation than just lacking money. It involves not being able to participate in normal activities, economic, social, cultural or political. The government said that social exclusion can occur when people or areas suffer from a combination of linked problems such as unemployment, poor skills, low income, poor housing, high crime environments, bad health and family breakdown. Factors such as age and disability contribute to social exclusion, but the Poverty and Social Exclusion Survey in 2000 found that the poverty has the biggest effect. These problems trap people in a spiral of disadvantage and limit their opportunities as well as those of their children. For example, having a low income may mean having to live in an area with poor schools, reducing the child's later chances in life because they have had a poorer education. So, thank you for listening. This was the definitions of poverty for work, poverty and welfare, A-level Sociology revision. Hello and welcome to definitions of poverty for the work, poverty and welfare, A-level Sociology. So today we are looking at the definitions of poverty